Yes,
I
sir.
think I have some interesting
Very
stuff.
good.
Let me tell you.
So,
We had a lot of latitude in those days. We had latitude because we had a great director, Joseph Schwartz, whose compassion extended itself in this manner. Not only did he want everything that could be done and done fast, but he knew that he had to trust people. And when he had a hunch that he had a good person, he didn't shackle us with a lot of rules and regulations. He encouraged our kind of buccaneering quality. Now that's dangerous stuff in the hands of less than responsible people, but in those days, I did things that I would not normally have been brought up to do. For example, I got a hold of a JDC person in Denmark, in Copenhagen. Buy butter, eggs, and cheese. $250,000 worth. I wanted at Bergen-Belsen. They were complaining, the Jewish leadership, Yosla Rosenstoff, that nothing was being done. He's quite a vocal, articulate fellow. And I made the arrangements without any authority being given to me, and then I called a man that was then handling the Paris desk of JDC, who was not the European director, who was not a guy, a fellow that would do anything unusual, and who also didn't have much of a sense of humor. Harry D. Beale. And I called up Harry Beale and I said, look, I just bought $250,000 worth of butter, eggs, and cheese. Please tell the New York office to, I don't know, to pay some, deposit $250,000 in some account in New York. And he said to me, who gave you authority to do that? I said, how'd you do that? I said, Harry, I have confidence that when you tell the New York office by phone to give them that $250,000, they not only won't ask that question of why you did it and who gave you authority, they'll be tickled pink I did it. And that's exactly what happened. Now my problem was, how do you get $250,000 worth of butter, eggs, and cheese from Copenhagen to Bergen-Belsen when the German rail system, and there was no international rail traffic at that point. They weren't crossing the frontiers. The Danish weren't about to let their cars get in, or maybe boxcars get into Germany and not get them back, and German cars were probably all in use for the army. Whatever rate, you couldn't just freight it out of Copenhagen to the nearest shipping point of Bergen-Belsen. I had a young fella on my staff who I think was assigned to me by one of the American voluntary agencies, not a Jew, very nice young fellow. And I said, now look here, that stuff's going to arrive at the frontier, the Danish frontier up at Schleswig-Holstein, at approximately this hour on this day. Take note, you get up there. I don't care how you do it, but you get that stuff off those Danish boxcars, on the German boxcars, and you get it here. I have the foggiest notion how it can be done, whether it can be done, but I am determined that it must be done, and you're the guy to do it. And sure enough, he did it. And one of the most thrilling experiences was to see this stuff come, and the refugees in Belsen toting all this stuff in. That didn't solve the problem, but it was a tremendous boost of morale of a joint, incidentally, that many of them knew the tradition from World War II through their parents and had a name of magic. Now, you've also got to remember that some of them took the view that JDC was like a government. Some of them even could ask you to pension them, in effect. When I was in Milano later in Italy, I went to a meeting of refugees who were giving my Milan chief a hard time. I went to the camp and took them on, and what was true was a thing. And I was told, you've got to be careful because they'll throw chairs at you. The concept I was trying to get across to them that they have that JDC was not a government. These were people that were physically handicapped, and they kind of felt that disabled pensions should be paid by JDC, but you don't look for a government. Well, the confrontation was sharp, bitter, angry, but it was nobody threw a chair at me, fortunately. Yet they had done to one of my predecessors who went up there. So we go back to the picture. The chaplain picture is in Germany. I'm sure they did a great deal like other Jewish soldiers do. How much they did specially as chaplains, I can't be sure. I think the field, did you see Eli Rock?
Sure.
I think as you go to people that worked that I had out in the field, whether they be Munich or near Frankfurt, Munich was a big area of a number of camps, they would have had the day-to-day contact. I was so busy going around and monitoring and overall and negotiating with the army officials, etc., and making top policy questions and working even on the question of how the Jews got kosher food after the war.
Yeah, in other words, you never had to use some JDC people said that it was helpful having a chaplain there. Sometimes they would use the chaplain in order to facilitate certain things that they needed.
I had a rabbi on my staff. I didn't have him on my staff by choice. He was the late Alexander Rosenberg. He's a charming fellow. He was a friend. He was a brother of an old friend of mine. He came unassigned, and he wanted to do things in his own way, very clearly. Well, when you're dealing with God's missionary, it's kind of hard for him to feel outranked by a lowly director of the mission. But I felt I had a certain obligation for a certain oversight, and I couldn't just say, okay, Alex, I turn you loose, do anything you want, because while we were quite ready to do buccaneering, it had to be judiciously done, and I had to know what was being done to do it right. I don't think he was there very long, but one of my favorite experiences with him was that when he felt most constrained by me, he wanted to complain about me, and I said, fine, Alex, here's my secretary, take a cable to, I don't remember it was to Paris or New York or both, and tell him what's wrong with your director here, and I don't remember when, I think the wire was sent, but at any rate, he had the gracefulness of a good humor. There is a lovely story about him. He was we were pressing to get kosher food for the Jews in the first weeks, for the survivors. I had worked hard on that with General Beadle Smith and others in the Army, and we were then persuaded finally that it was absolutely not possible. There weren't enough undiseased cattle, etc., that they were ready to take and arrange for ritual slaughtering, and we were working to get the stuff out of New York. Remember at this point in the industry, we didn't have this big growth of the kosher TV dinners. Today there'd be no problem.
Right.
At that particular point, and we did get it. I think maybe freeze food was already in business at that point, but there was a beginning, and we got it. But the question was, in those first weeks, for very pious Orthodox Jews who wanted to observe the dietary laws. And I was finally persuaded, and I discussed this with Judge Rifkin. We were finally persuaded that we couldn't press the U.S. Army anymore. They couldn't solve that problem. And I told Rosenberg, after he's been with us and pressing it, that we have to lay off the U.S. Army on that problem anymore. Rifkin and I discussed it, et cetera, and we felt that they'd done everything in good faith. They couldn't do it. We'd have to wait for the delivery of kosher food there. And Jews, pious Jews, would somehow have to, non-trade foods, whatever they could get off the economy under it. He came to me one day with a couple bearded rabbis who came in, I don't know whether they were from the camps or from Gudas Israel or something, I don't know, whether they were outsiders. And he said to me, they want to go to see General Beadle Smith this was now, I guess, Beadle Smith. Anyway, they want to go, he was chief of staff, right? They want to get up to see General Beadle Smith, and I said, JDCs can't go to Beadle Smith anymore. We've had it. Oh, he says, listen, they don't speak English, he says. They speak only Yiddish. They need an interpreter. Won't you let me go as their interpreter? I said, Alex, you go as interpreter, but don't you push a different JC. Whatever they say, that's fine. You interpret for them, but don't you get up there doing what we... Well, sure enough, they, despite the shortage of cattle, they persuaded Beadle Smith, the three bearded Rabbanim, to do it. So they came down. Now he said to me, "See, Jake, they did it." I said, "Fine." I said, "But," he said, "You know what we did?" And we blessed Beadle Smith. he said, but you know, for a goy, you can't give him the full blessing. So we gave him, we didn't give him that full blessing. He doesn't know that, he said. So when Beetlesmith became ambassador to Moscow, I said to many of my friends, Beetlesmith is probably going to Moscow as ambassador, fortified by the knowledge that he's been fully blessed by the Jews. He doesn't know that we gave him an abbreviated version of the blessing. I hope it doesn't harm his efforts as the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. Okay, so what do we know about chaplains? We've got a lot of other vignettes.
That's right.
All right, what are you
Now,
going to ask me?
Now, one question here. You said that about 6 weeks from the end of the war, you were able to get into
I think
Europe.
I got there about June the 25th.
Okay, so it's
Yeah,
5,
right,
6 weeks, something
right.
of that sort. Now, some chaplains were operating for, they said, about 60 days without the help of JDC.
It's probably true because you see, first of all, they were operating as they liberated a given area, even
Right.
before all the armed forces,
Right.
even before all of, even
Right.
before the surrender.
Right.
There were parts of Germany were liberated. I'm
Right.
sure they were in there pitching. You know, some of them were in the camps. I mean, were in the the extermination camps too. There's no question about that. And they were there, and then they were there during this period certainly before we got in. And then you've also got to be fair and say that after I was there, before we got rolling with the staff and the stuff came in, it took another 2, 3, 4. I can't give the exact count.
Yeah.
2, 3, 4 weeks. But I can tell you from the minute that I set foot in Germany, and this is not a personal vindication,
I understand.
because I was a young man with a tremendous amount of physical energy, and my son of Orthodox parents, the son of an Orthodox rabbi. That I knew full well that somewhere in Europe, among those exterminated were my family, people that I had never met. So we went rolling.
What I wanted to ask now is that you may not be aware of this, but of how this might have worked out. But the JWB had a means of getting material over to Europe. And the question that's been raised by some people is that why didn't the JDC use that channel of getting material over before the war had ended, so that once that the war would end, they would have material?
Listen, I don't happen to know that channel, other than chaplains were accredited to the armed forces, and I assume they could get certain supplies over.
Right.
Prayer books and other things.
No, they were getting other things as well.
Yeah. Well, I really don't know the answer to that. The only one I met in Europe, Ike Tobin, that when he came through Frankfurt one day with another chap, and we always kid each other because I gave him marks in my first days in Europe and gave it to him at the so-called official exchange when he had marks that were not acquired on official exchange. And every year when we go to a conference, I always introduce him to whoever we find in the elevator and say, did you ever meet a rabbi who was as sharp as that? Here's the sucker that gave him very wonderful dollars for marks of at a regulated rate of exchange that was very invaluable. We always laughed at each other. I can't for the life of me tell you how much JDC lost on that deal, and JWB made. I don't know the answer to your question.
Now, what about the British chaplains? Did you have any? This is just an aside. Did you have any the British Jewish chaplains?
You know, I don't recall any one British chaplain, and certainly in the Belsen thing, while I worked with several men in the British Armed Forces, a young captain and an Israeli physician, wherever there were Jews of some ability, we always found them our allies and help and advice and, etc. But by the time we had a staff rolling, we had the official contact. A lot had to be done, through very official contact, and we were able to do it. So I would say, my hunch is other than as you check it out where I had, well, one of the men I had left in Bergen-Belsen has since died, so that's Mike Eigen. But my hunch is that the role the chaplains played was significant in the immediate period following the liberation of their area, not when Germany surrendered, and in the first week thereafter. Other than that, I suspect they were like other Jews that tried to be as
Well,
helpful as possible.
they still had opportunities to do things for the remnants that other people, the GIs, weren't permitted to do.
Yeah.
A chaplain could get around. He had a jeep. He had.
Yes. I would say on that. Well, I think on that, in all fairness, that has to come from the people working in the field. My people that were in the field that would work on it.
Okay. Well, you see.
You've got to get.
Well, that's important.
I want to be fair to these people because I have a short and intense period which dates from about June the 25th through, let us say, January 9th. It's hard for me as I look back to believe it's 7 or 8 months because we packed so much into it. But I was racing around this country, with basically troubleshooting on everything, including maintaining liaison with mostly the British Army and the Americans. I how I got Yesler Rosensaft out of. I don't know if that's very valuable, but take this little story.
Okay.
I met up with Yesler Rosensaft. He was then, I guess, the informal or formally the chairman of the Bergen-Belsen Refugees Committee. I don't know whether he got that by acclamation, by self-appointment, or what have you. But I was very, very impressed with him. I found myself essentially in being with him to the commander of the camp all the time when he wanted something for the refugees, being his interpreter, and I was struck by his boldness and by his vigor. I also then met Ada Bimco, now his wife, but I was very, very impressed with him, and we worked closely together at that period. And I said to Joe Schwartz, there's a man here that I consider the Abe Lincoln of Jewry. He says, yes, Jake. Is he that good? I said, he's terrific, Joe. Well, he said, we need somebody to open the opening dinner of the United Jewish Appeal to be held in Atlantic City in December 1945. So I said, Joe, he doesn't speak English, speaks Yiddish. But he said, that's all right, if he's what you say he is. Joe had never met him, but he told me this. Let's get him here. So I arranged to smuggle him out of the British zone of Germany because the British official was hostile to this whole. They saw this as a whole anti-propaganda move, complicating their problems with the mandate, et cetera, naturally at that point. So we really, I think we had a number of vehicles in our use. I think it was an ambulance. We used something where we hid them, got them into the American zone. The American zone was easy. We got them into Paris. I say we smuggled them out of the British zone. Once we got them in the American zone, that was easy because the Americans didn't have an anti-policy at that point, any official government policy. We got them into Paris. I took them to Orly Airfield. We flew them to the United States. He wowed them. I'm told I had a brother-in-law who was then, I believe, one of the big factors in one of the United Jewish Appeal campaigns in northern Jersey, and told me that despite his lack of Yiddish, he made a tremendous impact. Well, that's understandable if you know the climate of the American Jewish leadership. December 1945, so shortly after the war, feeling very upset why so few had survived, why they weren't able to do more for those that survived, a mixture of compassion and guilt, and so that anybody that spoke with vigor, even if they couldn't understand and got a few interpretations, was very much overwhelmed. And he wowed them in Atlantic City.
If I just might tell you my impressions of what I'm getting from people from the JDC and the chaplains, is that it seems that on your level, the chaplains were not important or essential in helping you get to the Army, help you in any way. But it seems that on with the linemen, the men who worked for you in the field, they work either together with the chaplains or the chaplains help them, they help the chaplains, etc.
I'm sure that's correct. I would say this to you from the to know what they did. I'm sure there's no question in the local situation.
Right.
A chaplain who has, you say, more flexibility, had motor power, had a certain standing with his arm thing, had a freedom, could do certain things, even if they were violating the rules, nobody was going to pick up a chaplain on it. I'm sure our people used them well, because any American Jewish soldier, even if he wasn't a chaplain, that had a great interest was really pitching in. I'm sure that's so. I'm just saying from my personal experience,
Right.
at
Well,
the top level, it didn't.
Well, that's important,
Right.
because then we could say that at one point it was, one point it wasn't.
Right.
Now, you mentioned in particular that you had met Rabbi Klausner, but we didn't get into any detail with
let
that.
me tell you, Rabbi Klausner, Rabbi Klausner, I remember well. He seemed to be a little short. His hair seemed never combed. He was aggressive. He was an advocate of a very vigorous type. He would give everybody hell at a drop of a hat. He was very critical of JDC's early failure. I must say, cooperative to try to be very helpful once he recognized it. But I think he really enjoyed his very single-handed international, national role, Klausner Inc. If I assess it, I think you have to ask Klausner this. This is my impression. Now, there was plenty of room for that sort of activity, but Klausner reminds me a little bit of an experience I had in Istanbul, and I'll tell you the story and see if there might. I would think there's a touch of a parallel here.
Okay.
I came at one point to Turkey, and
When?
in January 1944, and I was really there on my way to Bulgaria and Romania. But the Russian, on the Allied Control Commission, these two countries were not about to let any Americans in, whether you were from New York Times or JDC. Charles Passman, whose name you know, and I waited for a long time to get visas into Bulgaria and Romania, probably 8 weeks or so. I finally did get into Romania, but before doing so, this is a little experience I had. There was a message that came to me by cable from my brother, who was then working for the JDC in Lisbon.
This is Harold.
Harold. And Harold cabled me that there was about 144 Jews that were on the Drottningholm who were pulled out of the concentration camps in the last days of the war because they claimed and somehow persuaded the Germans that they were Turks. Now, Turkey was neutral during the war, till the last few days of the war. So if they were considered Turks in the concentration camps, they were spared extermination. The cable was carefully coded, but it gave me a tip-off that they may be Turks for the Germans, but they won't be considered Turks by the Turks. So sure enough, when they arrived, the Turks wouldn't let them disembark as Turks. Their papers were not considered in order. They were kids probably born of Turkish parents, grandparents, or what have you. And the Drottningholm wasn't about to tie up its ship. So after a lot of negotiations I had with the government, and they agreed that they'd let them, till this matter was squared away, stay on a tender in the Bosphorus, and the big ship went away. I began negotiating for the release of these people. Now, I met up with a wonderful man named Simon Brod, B-R-O-D, who was a Turkish importer of British woolens, high-grade woolens, who I guess resided in Turkey for many, many years, was originally of Romania. He got involved in helping the thousands of Jews who came overland through Turkey to Israel, then Palestine. from Bulgaria and Romania. He was very effective in the days when all sorts of clandestine operations, bribery of petty officials. He once told me that every policeman in Istanbul or Yasmaster always got a bolt of cloth from him to make a uniform free. In fact, I'll verge a bit to tell you that what I love is one of my fondest stories, that when we used to go to Simon Brode's home on Sunday nights for get-togethers, kind of salons, and you had the people that worked together and some of his Turkish friends, Turkish-Jewish friends, and some diplomats. The British Consul General in Istanbul, I think it was a British Consul General, said one day to Brode on one of these Sunday nights, "Mr. Brode," he said, "you know, I'm a career man of the British Foreign Service. And you know, I've been issuing these transit visas through Palestine for these Jews coming through, and on that basis they let them through Turkey. And he says, you know, the British Foreign Office is catching on to me. They know they're not transit visas through Palestine. It's just another way to get these Jews into Palestine." And so Brode said, "So what?" He says, "So what? I can be canned from the British Foreign Office after, and that's my whole life's career." So Brode turned to him and said, "Look," I've forgotten the man's name, "Sir, with me you will always have a job, but be sure to bring the rubber stamp with you." Now to go back to Klausner. I think in the early days, after we began to get organized, Klausner, no, I have to go back to Brode. Brode watched me operate, and I did all sorts of things, doing with high British government officials, sending telegrams to the International High Commissioner on Refugees, knowing full well that they would be read, the wiretap, so to speak, and read, keeping a pressure on the British government. I successfully negotiated them off the tender and negotiating them onto a hotel. We rented some hotels on a little island, very pretty, you know. We allowed police custody around them and made that deal. Brode found my methods too, they wasn't the same fun as bribing this policeman, this customs officer, you know, and he looked at me strangely. We're good friends, and you know, I think. But I kind of created technological unemployment for him. Now I think, well, I go back to Klausner. I think the one-man band of Klausner, which did a lot of good. My impression is he did have a difficult time adjusting to an international Jewish organization, even when it got equipped to do the job. In other words, I think it was much more fun for Klausner himself to be doing it. And that ought to be checked out more carefully. It's purely impressionistic on my part. I also must say to you that his kind of aggressive, abrasive effort is not my style. It doesn't mean we weren't plenty aggressive, but it's saying, so it may very well be a temperamental difference and not a substantial one there.
Right, but you acknowledge the tremendous good that he did.
Oh, no question about it. No question about it. Look, I think that I wish there was a better historical job to do. I think people ought to go back. See, I think your doctor is doing with the chaplains, but I wish somebody would go to try to ferret out the Jewish soldiers that were there, because I remember many of them approached me with a great deal of compassion of interest. I'm sure they violated every row in the book to get help to the Jewish refugees. I experienced enough of it to know that it's a natural thing.
Well, the problem is, of course, getting a hold of the Jewish soldiers.
Well, you know what you do? I know. Look, let me say this. I have not asked you unless you go for another doctoral thesis. Okay. I think as you find, I think the chain has to be reconstructed with some care. Just as you will find from the people that served under me in different areas, will lead you to the chaplains. They in turn will lead you to some things.
There's no question.
Did Eli Locke, was Eli Locke ever able to produce any people that he remembered after all these years, chaplains and others? Well, he worked with Klausner.
He worked with Klausner,
yeah.
And he worked somewhat with Browdy, with Bromowitz.
Well, he worked with Browdy. Now, Browdy I can't tell you anything about because he's related to me, and Heidelberg wasn't a big active location. I just came back through, had dinner with him once, etc. I actually, for historical purposes, yeah. I rejected him as a man to succeed me in Italy. You know that story? Yeah, I rejected him. But I'm not going to give this even to the history. It takes another 25 years. It's in the family. But if you turn off your tape, I'll tell you a cute story.
Okay.